So it's a great pleasure to say a few words about Billy Collins, widely regarded as the most popular poet in America, the author of 12 collections of poetry. He's a former Poet Laureate of the United States who was so good, I assume that he served 2 terms. But we think more importantly, Billy Collins was installed as a state poet by the Writers Institute on this very Page Hall stage on March 4th, 2004. So happy 20th anniversary, Billy. You were inducted alongside our late great friend Russell Banks, who was state author that year. And in accepting this honor, you said this, Billy, just in case you forgot. Quote, "Moving from the position of United States Poet Laureate to New York State Poet Laureate might seem like a demotion or a drop in rank in the military to the military-minded. It might even appear that I'm heading toward eventually being crowned laureate of my zip code. But in fact, it is very gratifying to be honored again as a representative of poetry, this time by my native state where I grew up, more or less." I should also note that you might have seen some purple and white here tonight on hats and clothing. This sort of turned into an impromptu reunion for the College of the Holy Cross. Billy Collins is a Holy Cross alumnus class of 63, and I know there's a strong contingent of Holy Cross alumni. Give a shout out or raise your hand if you're Holy Crossers. All right. And even if you're not from the Holy Cross College, you come to the right place because this is going to be a fantastic night. We're going to have a real treat before the conversation. We're going to have some poems read by Billy Collins. So we hope you are prepared to laugh a little bit. I think we all need a good laugh right now. So please give a warm 20th anniversary Page Hall, UAlbany welcome to Billy Collins.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Holy Cross alumni and also others. It's nice to be back in Albany and to revisit the New York State Writers Institute, which is one of the most distinguished and central to literature gatherings in the country. So I'm very happy to be here. Now this is the way it's going to go. Do I sound like a tough guy? I'm going to read for a little while. I'm going to read from a number of books, but also from Water, which is just came out. It's a little baby. It just came out a week ago. And then I'm going to have a talk with Joe Donahue up there. And question and answer, I think we have later. I don't know, but anyway, let me just get to it. I wanted to. This poem came about as some of my poems come about as like an irritant at reacting to something like a bit of sand in the oyster. I'm not saying this is a pearl, but the irritant was a couple of quotes by W.B. Yeats. And the first one serves as an epigraph to this poem, and he commented, not in a poem, but commented, "A poet never speaks directly as to someone at the breakfast table," sort of, God forbid. And then he also later said, "The poet is never that bundle of accident and incoherence that sits down to breakfast." So there's something embarrassing about breakfast to Yeats. Something wrong with it. So I wanted to take a counter approach here. And the poem is called "A Portrait of the Reader with a Bowl of Cereal." Every morning I sit across from you at the same small table, the sun all over the breakfast things, curve of a blue and white pitcher, a dish of berries, me in a sweatshirt or robe, you invisible. Most days we are suspended over a deep pool of silence. I stare straight through you or look out the window at the garden, the powerful sky, a cloud passing behind a tree. There is no need to pass the toast, the pot of jam, or pour you a cup of tea, and I could hide behind the paper, rotate in its drum of calamitous news. But some days I may notice a little door swinging open in the morning air, and maybe the tea leaves of some dream will be stuck to the china slope of the hour. Then I will lean forward, elbows on the table, with something to tell you, and you will look up, as usual, your spoon dripping milk, ready to listen. Thank you. And this is a thank you. This is a poem. The first line of the poem gives the false impression that it's going to be a sexy poem, which it's not. So forgive that. It's called Downpour. Last night we ended up on the couch trying to remember all of the friends who had died so far. And this morning I wrote them down in alphabetical order on the flip side of a shopping list you had left on the kitchen table. So many of them had been swept away as if by a hand from the sky. It was good to recall them, I was thinking, under the cold lights of a supermarket as I guided a cart with a wobbly wheel up and down the long, strident aisles. I was on the lookout for blueberries, English muffins, linguine, heavy cream, light bulbs, apples, Canadian bacon, and whatever else was on the list, which I managed to keep grocery side up, until I had passed through the electric doors to the outside, where I stopped to realize, as I turned the list over, that I had forgotten Terry O'Shea, as well as the bananas and the bread. It was pouring by then, spilling, as they say in Ireland, people splashing across the lot to their cars. And that is when I set out, walking slowly and precisely, a soaking wet man bearing bags of groceries, walking as if in a procession, honoring the dead. I felt I owed this to Terry, who was such a strong painter for almost forgetting him, and to all the others who have formed a circle around him in the sky. I was walking more slowly now in the presence of the compassion the dead were extending to a comrade. Plus, I was in no hurry to return to the kitchen, where I would have to tell you all about Terry and the bananas and the bread. Thank you. I'm an only child, and I'm sure there are, statistically, there must be some of you here. The lights aren't quite bright enough, but I can spot you. You have a look. And if there's a signing line up here, there'll be a special express line for if you're an only child, because you deserve that. So here in this poem, titled Only Child, I address the subject. I never wished for a sibling, boy or girl. Center of the universe, I had the back of my parents' car all to myself. I could look out one window, then slide over to the other window without any quibbling over territorial rights. And whenever I played a game on the floor of my bedroom, it was always my turn. Not until my parents entered their 90s did I long for a sister, a nurse I named Mary, who worked in a hospital 5 minutes away from their house and who would drop everything, even a thermometer, whenever I called. Be there in a jiff and on my way were two of her favorite expressions. And now that the parents are dead, I wish I could meet Mary for coffee every now and then at that Italian place with the blue awning, where we would sit and reminisce even on rainy days. I would gaze into her green eyes and see my parents, my mother looking out of Mary's right eye, and my father staring out of her left, which would remind me of what an odd duck I was as a child, a little prince and a loner who would break off from his gang of friends on a Saturday and find a hedge to hide behind. And I would tell Mary all about that too, and never embarrass her by asking about her non-existence. And maybe we would have another espresso and a pastry, and I would always pay the bill and walk her home. Thank you. And this is called Walking My 75-Year-Old Dog. She's painfully slow, so I often have to stop and wait while she examines some roadside weeds as if she were reading the biography of a famous dog. And she's not a pretty sight anymore, dragging one of her hind legs, her coat too matted to brush or comb, and a snout as white as a marshmallow. We usually walk down a disused road that runs along the edge of a lake whose surface trembles in a high wind and is slow to ice over as the months grow cold. We don't walk very far before she sits down on her worn haunches and looks up at me with her rheumy eyes. Then it's time to carry her back to the car. Just thinking about the honesty in her eyes, I realize I should tell you she's not really 75. She's 14. I guess I was trying to appeal to your sense of the bizarre, the curiosities of the sideshow. I mean, who really cares about another person's dog? Everything else I've said is true, except the part about her being 14. I mean, she's old, but not that old. And it's not polite to divulge the true age of a lady. Thank you. I was fooling with you there a little bit. And here's a joke. There's the word joke in the first line here, so it wasn't that bad a slip. I said what I was looking at. It's called 1960. In the old joke, the marriage counselor tells the couple who never talks anymore to go to a jazz club, because at a jazz club, everyone talks during the bass solo. But of course, no one starts talking just because of a bass solo, or any other solo for that matter. The quieter bass solo just reveals the people in the club who have been talking all along, the same ones you can hear on some well-known recordings. Bill Evans, for example, who is opening a new door into the piano while some guy chats up his date at one of the little tables in the back. I have listened to that album so many times I can anticipate the moment of his drunken laugh, as if it were a strange note in the tune. And so, anonymous man, you have become part of my listening, your romance, a romance lost in the past, and a reminder somehow that each member of that trio has died since then, and maybe so have you, and sadly, maybe she. This poem arose out of reading, thumbing through Elizabeth Bishop's big collected poems, and I came to a point where there were two poems facing each other, and one was titled Sleeping on the Ceiling, and the other one was Sleeping Upside Down. And I thought, well, okay, this is poetry, but the license there. But I thought the only way, I wanted to get in there somehow, and I thought the only way to get into be part of that is to go conservative. So I wrote a poem called Sleeping on My Side that becomes a sonnet somehow. Every night, no matter where I am, when I lie down, I turn my back on half the world. At home, it's the East I ignore, with its theaters and silverware, as I face the adventurous West. But when I'm out on the road in some hotel's room 213 or 402, I could be pointed anywhere, yet I hardly care as long as you are there, facing the other way, so we are defended in all degrees, and my left ear is pressing down, as if listening for hoofbeats in the ground. So thank you very much. So I'll read a couple of poems from Water, Water. And the first poem, I'm not going to read the whole book, but the first poem is called Fire. I'm having a swell time reading Lonesome Dove. Glad I still have 400 pages to go. But this paperback is one of 1,000 things around me I would not grab as I dashed into the street if the house ever decided to burst into flames. I probably couldn't find the cat for all the smoke filling every room. So let me see, give me a minute. I should have thought of this earlier, before the fire trucks arrived and men in helmets were rushing past me. But here I am, out on the lawn in a bathrobe with a few sleepy neighbors, red lights flashing all over us. I'm holding a photograph to my chest, and the cat is sitting next to me, apparently mesmerized by the flames. I'm happy with my choice as I look down at you and me in a frame. And here's a chance for a fresh start, I figure. And as for the ashes of Lonesome Dove, I can always get another copy, or maybe that's just where I was meant to stop reading. Thank you. A lot of poets teach these days, and someone said poets used to hang out in cafes, now they hang out in universities. But not too many of them write about teaching. I think some poets feel they have transcended employment, for example, and marriage, too. The wife is sometimes not mentioned anywhere. Anyway, this is a poem about the classroom experience. It's called BC/AD. One autumn afternoon in the mid-'70s, when the two realms of Christian time were still being referred to as BC and AD, a student of mine raised her hand. She had found an error in our textbook. The dates of Plato are messed up, she said. How could he be born in 428 and die in 327? What, was he going backwards? I suppose you could say that everyone before Christ was, in a sense, going backwards in time without knowing it, I said. Then from the back of the room was heard, so what, did they all start going forward at Christmas? There are moments in a teacher's life when a discussion has gotten interestingly out of control, and it's time for the allegorical figure of reason to enter the stadium. So while some students joked about the ancients and their togas getting younger by the year, I drew a long horizontal line on the board to represent all of human time, then a vertical line intersecting it at the birth of Christ. And I added a stick figure of Plato standing on the line and a little zero off to the side. You see, I announced, Plato was born 428 years before the birth of Christ. But how did they know that, she asked. Excellent question, I replied, shaking my head. Then from the back, another excellent one. And why did the languages change from English to Latin, from before Christ to Anno Domini? You'd think it would be the other way around. You would think, I repeated, me moving over to the big school window, one finger pressed pensively to my lips, to observe the orange and yellow trees, patches of blue beyond them, and a few ordinary birds darting across the scene, until the bell signaling the end of our class and the beginning of something else rang. This was, after all, an introduction to poetry. Thank you. I have a poem. If you remember anything about the 20th century, you'll recall a lot happened, but also we handled time in a new way. I think. I don't think other centuries did this. We did that by slicing the century into decades that were then given the kind of human characteristics. So it would be the 60s, and it's not the 70s anymore, and that kind of thing. Very 80s of you to say that. To make sense of the past. So I wanted to, and we are always made to feel somewhat nostalgic about the passing of these decades, as if we wanted to get stuck in one of them for eternity. So this poem is kind of a reaction to that, and it's titled Nostalgia. Remember the 1340s? We were doing a dance called the catapult. You always wore brown, the color craze of the decade. And I was draped in one of those capes that were popular, the ones with unicorns and pomegranates and needlework. Everyone would pause for beer and onions in the afternoon, and at night we would play a game called Find the Cow. Everything was hand-lettered then, not like today. Where has the summer of 1572 gone? Brocade and sonnet marathons were the rage. We used to dress up in the flags of rival baronies and conquer one another in cold rooms of stone. Out on the dance floor, we were all doing the struggle, while your sister practiced the Daphne all alone in her room. We borrowed the jargon of farriers for our slang. These days, language seems transparent, a badly broken code. The 1790s will never come again. Childhood was big. People would take walks to the very tops of hills and write down what they saw in their journals without speaking. Our collars were high. Our hats were extremely soft. We would surprise each other with alphabets made of twigs. It was a wonderful time to be alive, or even dead. I am very fond of the period between 1815 and 1821. Europe trembled while we sat still for our portraits. And I would love to return to 1901, if only for a moment, time enough to wind up a music box and do a few dance steps. Or shoot me back to 1922 or 1941, or at least let me recapture the serenity of last month when we picked berries and glided through afternoons in a canoe. Even this morning would be an improvement over the present. I was in the garden then, surrounded by the hum of bees and the Latin names of flowers, watching the early light flash off the slanted windows of the greenhouse and silver the limbs on the rows of dark hemlocks. As usual, I was thinking about the moments of the past, letting my memory rush over them like water rushing over the stones on the bottom of a stream. I was even thinking a little about the future, that place where people are doing a dance we cannot imagine, a dance whose name we can only guess. Thank you so much. And here's a poem called, it was here last time, called Cheerios. This is a sign that poems can arise from very ordinary subjects. Cheerios. One bright morning in a restaurant in Chicago, as I waited for my eggs and toast, I opened the Tribune, only to discover that I was the same age as Cheerios. Indeed, I was a few months older than Cheerios, for today, the newspaper announced, was the 70th birthday of Cheerios, whereas mine had occurred earlier in the year. Already I could hear them whispering behind my stooped and threadbare back, "Why, that dude's older than Cheerios." The way they used to say, "Why, that's as old as the hills." Only the hills are much older than Cheerios or any American breakfast cereal, and more noble and enduring are the hills, I surmised, as a bar of sunlight illuminated my orange juice. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Yeah, this is another sonnet, and this was occasioned by just noticing and driving around America all of the signs announcing gated communities and condo developments, and usually involving an animal of some kind. So you have like Deer Hollow and Squirrel Meadow or something like that. And it started me thinking that these are maybe animals that have been driven out of their habitat in order to build these houses, which gave these signs a kind of elegiac undertone. So I wrote this poem called "The Golden Years." It's from the point of view of a retiree, a widow, and it's a sonnet. All I do these drawn-out days is sit in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge, where there are no pheasant to be seen, and last time I looked, no ridge. I could drive over to Quail Falls and spend the day there playing bridge, but the lack of a falls and the absence of quail would only remind me of Pheasant Ridge. I know a widow at Fox Run and another with a condo at Smoky Ledge. One of them smokes and neither can run. Said, I'll stick to the pledge I made to Midge. Who frightened the fox and bulldozed the ledge? I ask in my kitchen at Pheasant Ridge. We read a couple more poems, then I'm going to read some really, really short poems that won't take long, and then we're going to have a conversation. This is called The Trouble with Poetry, and it's not that long, don't worry. It's just about one of the troubles with poetry. The trouble with poetry. The trouble with poetry, I realized as I walked along a beach one night, cold Florida sand under my bare feet, a show of stars in the sky. The trouble with poetry is that it encourages the writing of more poetry, more guppies crowding the fish tank, more baby rabbits hopping out of their mothers into the dewy grass. And how will it ever end unless the day finally arrives when we have compared everything in the world to everything else in the world, and there is nothing left to do then but quietly close our notebooks and sit with our hands folded on our desks? Poetry fills me with joy, and I rise like a feather in the wind. Poetry fills me with sorrow, and I sink like a chain flung from a bridge. But mostly poetry fills me with the urge to write poetry, to sit in the dark and wait for a little flame to appear at the tip of my pencil. And along with that, the longing to steal, to break into the poems of others with a flashlight and a ski mask. And what an unmerry band of thieves we are, cut purses, common shoplifters. I thought to myself as a cold wave swirled around my feet and the lighthouse moved its megaphone over the sea, which is an image I stole directly from Lawrence Ferlinghetti, to be perfectly honest for a moment, the bicycling poet of San Francisco, whose little amusement park of a book I used to carry in a side pocket of my uniform up and down the treacherous halls of high school. So the book before Water, Water was called Musical Tables, and it was a collection of very, very short poems, some 2, 3, 4 lines maybe, extremely short poems. Poems that really were not so much written as they just kind of fell out of the sky or something and required no revision. They kind of were there whole. And it was called Musical Tables as a play on musical chairs, only there was no place to sit down. There was no music. And it was all rather pointless. And so I'm just going to read a few of those, just the title and the little poem. 3 a.m. Only my hand is asleep, but it's a start. We'll never get through this. Carbon dating. He tried it once as a last resort, but most of the women were 1,000,000 years old. Some of these are a little sad. The title is very important here. Refrigerator light. The minute she slams the door, I stop thinking about her. And this is motel parking lot. Saying goodbye is so sad, I don't even bother to turn around to see what it was you just threw at me. I'm staying in a nice hotel here in Albany, but this is called Bad Hotel. I told the woman from housekeeping who was eager to do my room to just come in and pretend I'm not here, which is exactly what I had been doing ever since I checked in. This is called New York Directions. It's down in the village between Bleak and Bleakest. Now, believe it or not, the title of this poem is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Trouble was not his middle name. And this one is also sad. It's called Divorce. No more heavy ball, just the sound of the drag chain with every other step. And finally, a poem called Children. There's a new movie out called Children. I don't know what it's about, but I like the voice on the radio when it says, children now playing everywhere. So now, thank you so much. So now, Joe Donahue and I are going to have a little talk. Thank you.
That was delightful.
Thank you.
Something happened here. Wait, you'll notice it wasn't like this during our sound check, was it? But it happens to the best of us. All right. Do you get excited when you have a new collection out?
Do I get excited? Oh yeah. Yeah. I think it looks good. I'm glad it's out, and this is you can probably tell from my voice that this is the last stop on a book tour. So I've been started in Hawaii about 10 days ago, but I still have enough to talk. But yeah, it's exciting. I think of the book as a commodity. I'm not above thinking that book sales are a business, and so yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we should all have such problems if it is a problem.
The process of putting a collection together, what is that like for you, and the writing and the selection and figuring out what's going to go where?
Yeah. Well, that's a fun part. But well, basically, I'm never thinking about as I'm writing a poem. I'm never thinking about it as being part of a book. I don't think of it as a brick that's going to go in the wall. It's part of something bigger. So all the poems are done individually, and I'd say it's like ball players say, we're just going to take one game at a time, as if there were an alternative to that. So it's just one poem at a time. And then after, it's usually every 2 years or so, I think maybe there's enough poems to make a book, and I'll kind of rake them together and see and often, no, you're not ready for a book, and keep writing. So if I have enough poems, if I have maybe 75 poems, I'll send them to my editor, And I've never really gotten much of a line edit, for like sentence by sentence, or I find that a kind of invasion of privacy. But I asked my editor, who's a wonderful guy, David Ebershoff at Random House, to see if he can find a few weaker poems. Not too many, but maybe like 6 or 7, maybe tops. But he'll find poems that don't seem to fit exactly, or are less, don't live up to the standard maybe set by the better poems, and that kind of narrows it down. And I order the poems in some way. It's a bit mysterious. Hardly anybody, I think, reads a book of poems front to back. And usually, I find someone else's book and I use it as a flip book, and I'm looking for kind of a weird title or a short poem or some point of insertion where I can read the book. So it's really assiduously ordering the poems putting them in a certain order is really an author's vanity. It's for fun for the author, but there's not much payoff for the reader.
But there has to be a pacing that you're looking for, that you would like.
Well, less than you would think. I like to start with a strong poem. Somehow books have gotten in the habit of books of poetry being divided into usually 3 or 4 parts.
Right.
And maybe that's to just give the reader a break, or I don't know what. But at least you can think about it coming in parts, and like a poem comes in stanzas, so that gives you something else to think about. So I would try to start with a couple of strong poems. Each section ends with a strong poem. Maybe the title poem begins one of the sections, that kind of thing. And then you have a point at the end of the book where, can I read this short poem?
Yes.
Well, I want to read a pre-poem before that. So once I get in there, this is the poem that I wrote a few years ago. It's called "The Garland," and it's really a solution to the problem of mortality. If that doesn't get your attention, it's called "The Garland." I would like to be laid to rest in a big tomb topped by the stone figure of an angel, who appears to have landed there in order to sob forevermore. Her face buried in her bent arm, one folded wing hanging by her side. Then, whenever I found the time to visit my own grave, after approaching with slow, respectful steps, I would place around her rough neck the garland of wildflowers that I knitted, then run back to the car, laughing and immortal. And so this is an answer to that poem. It ends, "Water, water." It's called "A Change of Heart." And the poet I refer to as Oshima Ryoto, an 18th century Japanese poet. "A Change of Heart." I once expressed the wish for a tomb topped by a white marble angel, her head buried in her folded wing. But now I'd rather you just copy out that little poem by Ryota, fold it into quarters, then slip it into my shirt pocket before I am incinerated in a chamber. It's the one where he used to think that death came only to others, but now, in his ultimate hour, he realizes that this happiness is also his. So, those are like companion poems.
Yes. So, before we came out, we were in the green room, and Billy said, "Well, I'm going to read some poems," and then I said, "Okay," and then I said, "I've chosen some that I'm hoping you would read, and I just want to make sure that they don't, that I'm not repeating myself." And so I gave him the poems, and I said, "So those weren't in your menu, were they?" And he said, "No, I wouldn't have chosen those."
Never.
Now, what I want to know is, so what does that say?
I've never read them out loud, actually, so I don't know how they play. Maybe I'm wrong.
All right. Well, so the one that I wanted to start with, and it is magical realism. And it's a dog poem.
Okay, it is a dog poem. Magical realism. It's a rainy Saturday night in London, and many of the male dogs have gathered at their favorite pub, the Ball and Stick, where they lower their heads to drink from their bowls of ale. For this is not an off-the-wall cartoon where they would be leaning on the bar, holding a pint glass impossibly in one paw. No, this is just a bit of fiction, but not by a fantasist of South America, where many strange things are done. And that's why the dogs are not smoking cigars or playing darts or gossiping about their owners, nor is there any laughter, no sports on the telly, no backslapping, which would require standing up all night on your hind legs. And that's also why it's so quiet for a Saturday night with your mates, unlike the clamor down the lane at the Axe and Hammer or around the corner at the King's Piston. Here it's just the low sounds of lapping and a round of barking every time a new dog happens to walk into the door. Yes, on all fours and without a stitch of clothes. So
that played well.
all right, that was pretty good.
Yeah.
You're right. You're right. Well, I also said it's all gold, so.
Yeah, you did say that.
I did say that.
You
But
said
I
that.
was fooling with the dial of realism to surrealism. You know, I wanted to get around to 6, where the dogs are drinking at a pub, but they're not standing up. They're still dogs. I wanted to retain their doggy nature without having them, play poker and stuff like that.
This is a dumb question, but is it? Do you consciously do that of thinking about like that it's going to be in about a 6? Like you don't want to go too far. You don't want to go.
Well, that's an afterthought, but I just I want to start out with a kind of Walter Cronkite voice here, I guess. It's a rainy night in London, and many of the male dogs have gathered in their favorite pub, the Ball and Stick. So it's kind of a reportorial voice, and I want to keep that sobriety throughout, even though the scene gets a little crazier. But I like a round of barking every time a new dog happens to walk in the door. And they get back to drinking beer. I don't know. I get paid for it.
Yeah. Good on you. Good.
Thank you there.
Give page 50, Zero Grannies, which is just a great title.
Could be a punk band, Zero
Yes,
Grannies.
Zero Grannies.
Playing at CBGB's. Well, this has the benefit of being true, the truth in the first few lines. Zero Grannies. By the time I was born, both of my grandmothers had died, so I never got a chance to observe one of them ironing in a hallway or sitting on a porch talking to herself about something or other. I have no poem to write about their aprons or their hands. Oh, those hands caked with flour that bake so many pies. It would take a windowsill a mile long for all of them to cool. I can't even picture one carrying her missal to church in the snow, nodding to the sacristan, while the other one remains confined to her room for some unknown reason. Nor can I hear the clicking of their needles. So, reader, you can thank the mortality rate of 19th century North America for leaving this poet free to record things like 5 birds on a wire, a lost dog pausing under a streetlight, or 3 lemons doing nothing in a bowl. So all 4 of my grandparents were dead when I was born, so I had no grannies or granddads. But that's okay. I didn't mind being an only child, and I didn't miss. You don't miss what you don't have, so I didn't miss the dandling or whatever else you do with your grandmother. And also I would rather write about a dog pausing under a streetlight and 3 lemons in a bowl or whatever than grandparents. Or I have very few people in my poems. There are very few in all these books. There's hardly anybody but me, the only child writer, because I want to be alone with the reader. And if you have, if I'm conducting a workshop, a poetry workshop, I tell them if I come across I have deal breakers. If I come across the word dad, dad did this, or grandpa, I just stop reading. I'm out. Because if you want to write about your family and a bunch of other people, you should write fiction. The intensity of poetry is that you're alone with the reader, right? Like the portrait of a reader with a bowl of cereal. And when I was an only child, I started writing poetry now that I think about it, because it was really an intensification of being alone. I wanted to be more and more alone, like people who get tattoos and can't stop. I wanted to be super alone. And so in the poetry, I think it's a very private conversation between one person and another. And if you have grannies in there and your brother and your uncle and all that stuff, I don't know. So being an only child and having very little family has turned out to be excellent preparation for writing poems, for my poems anyway.
Billy Collins is our guest. The new book is Water, Water. Do you think about, without having people, then that allows you to, as you say, you'd rather look at the lemons or other things, then that doesn't tell us a tremendous amount about you, right? I mean, we know about your thoughts. We know that you're as old as Cheerios, but there aren't a lot of things that we know.
No, and I'd like to keep it like that, and in spite of this radio program. But no, I'm not an autobiographical poet. I mean, I bring you into the intimacy of what I'm thinking and imagining, but there's very little information. If you were basing a biography on me based on the poems, I mean, I had parents. That's undeniably true, and they enter poems here and there. But no, you wouldn't know about. I'm not a conveyor of the past. Most of the poems include a present moment. So most of the poems take place. If they don't take place in the present moment of a certain time period, they take place in the present immediacy of the poem itself. That the poem, almost all the poems are composed in one sitting. And I do that because I want to find the ending. I mean, in class they talk about the symbol of this and this metaphor, blah, blah, blah. I'm just thinking about how do I get out of this thing? I mean, I need to do something else. So like the trouble with poetry, I didn't know. It was about time to get out of it. I could tell that the ending should be coming up pretty darn soon. And then I thought of that line from Lawrence Ferlinghetti that I'd copied down somewhere. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll just cop to it and say I stole it from Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And then the poem ends with Lawrence Ferlinghetti and my memory of being in high school and being influenced by the Beat generation and carrying around poetry books in my pocket in high school.
So, apropos of what we were just talking about, on page 113, it's a poem toward the end of the book, and it is in the present.
I see what you're getting at.
See, yeah. See.
Yeah. Okay, you got me.
And
no need to read it. Really.
The name of it is Autobiography.
Okay. Autobiography. This morning I began writing mine, but 5 hours later, and many legal pads later, I had gotten only as far as my conveyance from the French hospital in New York City to my parents' apartment. Of course, I could have devoted less time to the bodily process of my birth, the details of my wicker bassinet, as well as the many metallic animals endlessly circling above me as I lay supine, helpless and staring. And so after a sandwich for lunch, with so much work ahead of me, including a catalog raisonné of my toys, an account of the tiles on the bathroom wall, behind which resided my imaginary friend, I decided to abandon the whole project and maybe settle for a little essay on the subject of the wallpaper or the taste of prunes. Plus, I already could hear the voices of the vicious reviewers happy to dwell on my shortcomings, my love of personification, the melancholy tricycle, for example, the limits of the first-person selfish point of view, not to mention the overall lack of a clear theme. And they would be right about the pages and pages of endless dialogue, senseless dialogue, not to mention the tedium of chronological order, even though that seems to be the way my life has chosen to unfold itself, at least so far. So.
But that is an interesting point, and going back to what you were saying earlier, it isn't chronological in the sense of it's what you were thinking of at that moment, and more, and I mean this as in a
Yes.
good way of scattered, right?
Well, one of the French filmmakers, Trousseau, I think, said that every film has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. So, but also, poetry really frees you from chronology, unlike the novel, which you can play with time in the novel like Faulkner, but basically things roll chronologically. And there's no genre of written expression that offers more imaginative freedom, I think, than poetry. Freedom from chronology, for example. And you can be anywhere you want at any time and jump all over the place imaginatively. And you don't have to talk about, there's no, sex is not required as it is in the novel, and other bourgeois concerns, so to speak. I mean, like marriage and who's going to jump on whom, or so I know. We know the stuff that takes place in the novel, but I find.
What novels are you reading?
Yeah, any novel, just about. I just find those concerns claustrophobic because you're usually in a room with other people. My idea of hell.
When you think of something, and from the time you have the thought, let's just say Cheerios, for example, from the time that you think of that or overhear that, I assume you really overheard that.
Well, it would happen.
Or you read it.
That would happen. I opened the Tribune and I saw that I was the same age as Cheerios. So it was something Cheerios is 70 years old.
So from the time of knowing that to the time of writing about it, how much time passes?
No, almost no time. It's game on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anytime I think of a way to begin a poem or a possibility, it's totally game on. I just get after it right away and don't talk to me. And so I go deep, and I'm lose the sense of time, and I'm just focused there, and that's very much a part of the self-entertaining aspect of writing poems, that you're in this thing, and it's going to be new. No one else has done it, and you don't know what the ending is either. And so the ending's going to be some kind of surprise, and it's very exciting, mentally. So I don't think much I don't come to the page with a lot. I come with a little something, but. Someone said it's good to maintain the benefits of your ignorance for as long as you can when you're writing a poem.
So expand on that for a little bit of when you come to a poem with a little something, like what?
Well, I remember listening to Art Blakey's version of Three Blind Mice. He's a jazz drummer, and I was listening to it. Of course, there are no words in the jazz tune, but I started wondering how he could, as a jazz man, think there would be melodic possibilities in such a stupid song, which is the same tune as Hot Cross Buns, I think. Three Blind Mice, Hot Cross Buns. You know, it's a kid's song. And then I remember I was cooking. I was chopping parsley and garlic and stuff like that, and I started just thinking about the mice and how they came to be blind, and that was boom, yeah, that was forget dinner, you know. I get pizza, and I thought, you know, they could be. If it was congenital, they could be brothers and sisters. That's the way it starts. And I picture the poor mother brooding over her sightless young triplets. Or was it an explosion or something, a firework? But if not, if they each came to his or her blindness separately, how did they ever manage to find one another? You know, and that was how could it would be difficult for a blind mouse to locate even one with vision, let alone two other blind ones, right? And like that, you know.
So, oh, that's delightful. So, as far as because you are interested in humor, right? You are interested in that moment. I mean, just like when you were just saying that, like congenital is funny.
Yeah, right. Well, if we were talking about mice, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, words. Some words can be funny, like you know, collie is not funny. Schnauzer is funny, but. I don't know. When I was trying to write poems when I was in high school, in that period, I didn't think poems could be funny, and they couldn't be without being consigned to this little outlet called light verse. Poetry was supposed to be serious. And I was funny in school. My father was very funny, and I inherited that from him. And then later I started reading poets who were funny but dead serious about their purpose, like Philip Larkin and people of the New York school like Kenneth Koch and Frank O'Hara and others. And then I that was a big revelation for me that I could actually be funny but not for its own sake, funny as a device, often a disarming device to get people into the poem. Because the poem can begin, obviously, you can modulate from humor to sadness or reality, and go back to humor again. So it became a device, something along those lines. Humor is very. There's something authentic about humor, though. You know, you can. It's easy to pretend to be serious, right? If you've ever had a job, for example, or been in a classroom, or even now. I mean, Joe and I are we're being serious about this, right? But and you can all you have to do is go, interesting, and but you can't pretend to be funny. You know, either you're funny or you're not. I mean, if you try to be funny around your friends, and they don't laugh. It's like you're just bombed. But so there's something authentic about humor, and there's something also intriguing about causing an involuntary reaction in people, right? I mean, if you can make someone laugh, it's like making them sneeze. I mean, they can't help it. It's you have a little power over them, but I don't know.
So as you were reading to this audience earlier, and you were getting laughs, that feels good.
It feels good, but I also have to bring everyone under control at that point. No, I don't want it
can't go too far.
Well, I don't want it to be a laugh-a-thon, and so I have a list of poems a kind. I know. I just make. I look at the playlist and I jump all over the place and pick poems that are more serious. And if we're having too good a time, I'll put a more serious poem in, so that I'd like you all to leave here with a sense of pleasurable disorientation, so that you don't know exactly, was that funny or what, or but there was that thing about death, wasn't there? I don't know. What I try to do basically is avoid, there are two extremes in terms of tone, and one is hard and one is soft. One is sarcasm and the other is sentimentality. And there's a middle road which is called irony, where there's that the tragic face, the down look of and then the rictus smile of comedy, and then I guess the irony is sort of sneering slightly, but irony is a way of avoiding those two extremes, and I try to maintain a balance in the poem so that it's funny, but wait a minute, something is happening that's not that funny, right? And
I like the term pleasurable disorientation.
I do too.
Because I've been feeling the last couple, 3 weeks.
It's not so pleasurable.
I've been feeling the disorientation.
Yeah.
How do you make it pleasurable?
Right. Well, that's too big a question for me. Yeah. I don't know.
You don't get political, do you?
I don't.
Really?
No. I mean, I am. I mean, I have political thoughts, but they don't enter my poetry. I don't think a poet needs to keep up with the headlines. And
how could you?
I don't. I mean, and poems that are about the contemporary scene, it puts a expiration date on the poem. You know, if you mention 8-track or something like that in your poem, you just think it's this old poem. 8 poor guys, 8-track. So my persona here never refers to a computer or a Big Mac or stuff like that, or punk music or anything that would date the poem.
Yeah, except for Cheerios. Somebody said that.
Except for, yeah, all right. Yeah, well, it proves the rule, yeah.
When you are, we talked about this in the sense of a collection, but as you're working on something and you go into it and you say, even if you use humor to bring us into the poem, I mean, and I realize it's a different form, but if you're writing a joke, that's, you consider the punchline, but that for you then that is an entry point and can go on from there.
It can start as something humorous, yeah. I mean, those, and then I can get serious later on. I think I'm kind of repeating myself, but I'm just trying to. I mean, poetry is. We have to realize that poetry is basically lines. They come in. You're writing one line at a time, and that's. And in addition to writing sentences, you're trying to write good lines. And there are many definitions of poetry, like, the best words in the best order, or meaning that moves, the dancing of an attitude, very clever definitions of poetry. But there's only one airtight definition of poetry I've ever heard from Henry Taylor, and he says, poetry is an arrangement of lines whose length is determined by some principle other than the width of the page. Okay? The line does not go out to the end of the page. And that turning back, making the line then turning back into the poem, there used to be a metrical reason for that. Whose woods these are, I think I know, and you move back. His house is in the village, so. Well, if you don't write metrically formal or regular verse, then you can turn back anytime, but you have to turn back before you get to the end of the page, otherwise you're writing prose. You don't want that to happen. All right? So the turning back also is telling the reader, get back in here. Where are you going? Get back in here. This is the body of the poem. Come back into the body of the poem. So it's got recirculating your attention back into the poem, back into the poem. Shakespeare's sonnets are good like that. They come on, the way it holds your attention in that grip. So that's what when I'm writing, I'm thinking about good lines. I want to write one line at a time, and I want it to be a unit of something. Could be a unit of grammar or a unit of metaphor or humor or whatever. But Charles Olson said, no line must sleep. No line must sleep. Every line should be aware of the lines, of the words around it, the other lines around it. So that brings the poem. It brings the attention of the poem to itself when the poet is writing one line at a time, and that's the way the poem progresses, one line at a time. So you're thinking of sentences, but also lines at the same time. And then if you make a stanzaic decision, so you're going to have 4-line stanzas separated like that, then that's another restriction that you're thinking about. So what you're doing is shaping the poem. And what I tell students often, forget expressing yourself. Nobody cares. Nobody cares what you're thinking or feeling, because the reader doesn't know you, right? What you're after here is the love of strangers. The reader doesn't know you, and what you're doing is actually making something for the reader. That's what you're doing. You're not expressing yourself, because nobody cares who you are. That they care about poetry. That's why they're reading poetry. That's why they picked up your book, because they're in the poetry section. They love poetry. So in every one of your poems, you have to commit a little lie, and the lie is that you love poetry more than you love yourself, and that's not true, is it? So that when the reader picks up a book of poems, there's a sign of human intelligence, of shaping, of an architecture, of a design to the poem. Mary Oliver, bless her heart, said, at least our poems should at least be tidy. Like make the bed, for God's sake. Don't be a slob on the page. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm just going to push back gently and say that I understand your point about the caring aspect, but I would say, as evidenced by the full house we have here tonight, that people care very much about you and the work that you have done over your career.
Thank you. Thank you.
Billy Collins, ladies and gentlemen. The new book is Water, Water, Poems by Random House Publisher. A great pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it tremendously.
Thank you.
Do you mind taking a few questions, Billy? Sure. A couple questions. If you raise your hand, ask very quickly, and we'll get to a few of these.
Aside from the burden of traveling for your book tours and getting suggestions for poems probably dozens of times every day, is there a downside to being a rock star poet?
Not much of one, really, if you phrase it that way. Well, Max Beerbohm said that the most difficult thing about being a poet was figuring out what to do with the remaining 23 and a half hours of the day. Because you're not slaving away at a novel for years, and a lyric poem can be written in a few hours. But then, of course, the downside to that, if we're looking for one, I can scrape one up here. The poet returns to zero more frequently. So you've written the poem, and it's taken, for me, sometimes one day, and touch it up the next day. And now what? You have to start all over again with a whole new poem, different from the other poem. Whereas if you follow Hemingway's advice and you're writing a novel, you always go to bed in the middle of a scene. Lady Brett says something, then blah, 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 let's go to the bullfights or something. Then you go to bed, and when you wake up, go back to the desk, and you're right in the middle of a conversation. So we have to hit restart much more frequently than the novelists. I wouldn't have it any other way, but because it's good to have a sense of accomplishment in a few hours rather than, damn it, what's Edward going to do with Miriam? Is he or isn't he? Are they or aren't they? I don't care about any of that.
Are there specific duties to being Poet Laureate of the United States? Or do you sort of make it up once you're declared so?
Yeah, there's really no duties. You're supposed to give a little money to two other poets, and you give a reading at the Library of Congress. You are an employee of the Library of Congress, and you are appointed by the Librarian of Congress. It has nothing to do with the White House, and it's funded by a private fund, so it says less. And I think it's the Librarian of Congress, James Billington, who appointed me, agreed with me when I asked him if this was maybe the only autocratic decision in Washington. Now it's a little different with our new president. But he said, yeah, it's one of the maybe the only decision that doesn't involve committees and checks and balances and stuff. So, but Robert Penn Warren used the time to write All the King's Men. That's one thing you can do, or you can just blow smoke rings. You don't have to do anything. But my predecessors had been very proactive in the poetry scene, and so I came up with this program of Poetry 180. I picked 180 poems and put them on the Library of Congress website and encouraged high school teachers to read a poem to their students every day, 180 days of the school year, 237 in Japan. But we have 180 in summer school. So I did that, and then I was once asked by Congress to write a poem on the first anniversary of 9/11, when the joint sessions of Congress met in New York, with the first time, I believe, since the British burned down the Capitol in 1815. So I did write a poem for that, and I read it before Congress. And so that and Poetry 180 were my contributions. But technically, you don't have to do anything. And often I think, I can't think of a name now, but for an elderly person, it's often given as a kind of honorarium or an honored, I don't know if that's the word, but so yeah, it's I had lunch or dinner with Andrew Motion, who is the Poet Laureate of Britain at the time, and we were trying to think of a precedent that had the two Poets Laureate ever gotten together. We couldn't think of it, so we decided, well, this is an unusually historic event, and and let's have another bottle of that claret or something. But he was, talking about the fact that the British laureate has to write what are called occasional poems, right? If there's a coronation or the death of a viscount or something. And so when we finished dinner, I said to Andrew Motion, it looks like the difference is that you have to write occasional poems, and the American poet laureate just has to write occasionally. So.
I would remind you that Bookhouse still has books for sale afterwards. This will be our last question. You can line up if you have a book to be signed. Again, those 150, those were signed. Billy was kind enough to sign them beforehand. But if you line up against the wall, we'll bring up for a signing. And this will be our last question.
Hi, and thank you again for tonight. But I'm an educator and a writer locally. And I just see a real decline in, adolescent readership of poetry in general. And I guess my question for you would be, what advice would you give to, reacquaint kids and get them interested in reading poetry and writing poetry?
Yeah, I have the answer. Just kill social media. Here's what's really happening there, and there is this terrible decline in giving reading assignments that are more than a couple of pages or something, and to give students a novel, or they just don't know what to do with it. And the problem is, and here it is, the problem is, it's not that they don't like to read, it's that they don't like to be alone. They don't like to be alone. They're never alone. Their friends are right in their pocket there, and they're, hey, we're going for pizza. Cool. What kind of pizza? I mean, this just goes on like crazy. So yeah, it's social media has deprived young people of solitude, and there's a great argument for the powers of solitude, and that's the reason why they don't read, and that's how the pig got his curly tail.
Thank you all for coming tonight. What an amazing audience. One more time for Billy Collins.